Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the AgriSolar Clearinghouse webinar on AgriSolar in the Pacific Northwest. Today, we're going to be hearing from our partners at Renewable Northwest, Emily Griffith and Max Greene. Please drop your questions into the chat, and you can always email us at agrisolar@ncat.org. We will post a recording of this website in about 2 weeks to the website. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Emily now. And like I say, drop questions in the chat as you have them.
Great, thanks. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Emily Griffith. I'm the Strategic Engagement Manager for Renewable Northwest. Max, do you want to introduce yourself?
Happy to. Hello, everybody. My name is Max Greene. I am the Deputy Director of Renewable Northwest.
Yeah, and so today we're presenting on AgriSolar in the Pacific Northwest, and this presentation is largely inspired by a report we're working on here at Renewable Northwest about AgriSolar, our dual use in the region, as an update to our last report in 2019. But since then, there's been some policy changes and new research, so we decided it would be good to have an update on where we are now, and that's what we'll be presenting on today, mostly. The information that we've gathered so far for that report. Because this is an ongoing process, we'd love to hear from you all as well on anything that would be useful. So today, Max and I will be jumping back and forth. Max will give you some more information on our organization, Renewable Northwest, and the work we do here. I'll briefly mention why AgriSolar in this region is important to consider and preview some of the policy and funding options we now have. Max will talk more about energy needs and policy at length, and I will end with some new research and ideas on implementation.
All right, so I think that tees me up to talk a little bit about the organization. So Renewable Northwest is a somewhat unique organization. We are a 501c3 nonprofit advocacy group. We have a mission to decarbonize the electricity sector in the Northwest. And we are a membership-based organization. So our membership includes a number of mostly large, but also some small renewable energy developers that work in the Northwest, as well as a number of environmental organizations, especially those with a climate focus, and also some other folks who are active in the energy space in the Northwest, including consumer advocate groups such as the Citizens Utility Board in Oregon, and increasingly renewable energy buyers such as Google. So next slide, please. When we say the Northwest, we operate in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. We're headquartered in Portland, Oregon, which is roughly where both Emily and I operate from. We tend to do a lot of work in Oregon and Washington in particular. Montana's kind of probably next on the list, and Idaho, a little less than the other states, but still something we like to pay attention to. Next slide, please. And our work falls into three major buckets. The first sort of category that you can see on this slide is labeled planning. I tend to think of it as regulatory work, and what that looks like is work that ultimately is sort of carried out through the state regulators that have a significant say over the operations and planning conducted by investor-owned utilities. This work takes place at mostly public utility commissions, and it looks like deep engagement with utility resource planning. That's analysis to determine what the utility's needs are and how they will meet those needs, and procurement processes. So, when they actually go to market to try to bring on the resources they need. There's a bunch of other stuff that happens in the regulatory space, but I'll move on to policy. This looks like engagement mostly with state legislatures on clean energy policy. In the past, that has looked like helping to write, shape, and pass clean energy mandates in Oregon and Washington. Increasingly, it also looks like working on renewable energy siting and permitting policy. Let's hear plenty more about that, I think. Also, our policy work involves engagement with state agencies. So again, in that siting and permitting space, there are frequently other types of processes such as agency rulemakings that we get involved in. Last up, we've got markets and transmission. So this work tends to look like engagement sometimes with technical transmission processes such as interconnection queue reform. I won't dive into into that right now. Also looks like trying to make sure that we have a sufficient and efficient transmission system in the West to help us accomplish the clean energy transition. And markets are another piece of that. So we've been involved in helping to support and set up the California Independent System Operators Extended Day Ahead market, which makes the West a bit more interconnected, and ultimately in doing so makes it so that we don't need to bring as many new resources online. It saves money and it saves resources. And currently a similar effort is taking place through an entity called SPP that is launching a similar day-ahead energy market that they're calling this the Markets Plus initiative. But that's probably enough on the sort of basics of what we do. So next slide, please. Yeah, and I think it's back to you, Emily.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So why is AgriSolar important to consider in the context of the Pacific Northwest landscape? In many parts of our region, all of the best spots for solar have already been used, and we're at a point where we're having to discuss trade-offs with other land uses and priorities. Speaking of priorities for land, we have a lot of farmland in our region, with regulations requiring that land to be kept as farmland. However, even in the rainy Pacific Northwest, many parts of our states east of the Cascades, where a lot of that farming takes place, are suffering from drought conditions as well. Water use is a major concern for farmers east of the Cascades in the Northwest. As we've come to learn, AgriSolar offers benefits to help aid some of those challenges. Solar above crops decreases water needs. We also have mandates for our electricity to be 100% renewable in a few short decades or less. And renewable energy infrastructure is going to require land as well. With the benefits that AgriSolar can bring to crops, as well as the opportunity of collaborating with farmers to harness the sun in more ways than one, benefiting farmers, communities in our region, it goes to show that the Pacific Northwest is full of opportunity to deploy dual use solar and realize the potential that it has to offer. So as I mentioned, we have renewable energy goals, such as the Biden administration's goal of 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035. Washington and Oregon both have clean energy goals, with Oregon being 100% renewable by 2040 and Washington by 2045, with other benchmarks before then. We have also seen federal investments for not just renewable energy, but also dual use projects like agrivoltaics. The USDA announced funding for the program Sustainably Co-locating Agricultural and Photovoltaic Electricity Systems, or SCAPES, and awarded $10 million to the University of Illinois to determine best suited crops to pair with solar. And so results from that are expected in 2025. And the DOE, in 2022, the Department of Energy announced $8 million in funding for projects that integrate solar and farming, and that's intended to support agrivoltaics and maximize benefits to farmers and communities. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, it changes tax laws that impact the solar manufacturing industry in the US and incentivize more installations of solar projects here. The Loan Programs Office at the Department of Energy received $11.7 billion which is a large increase in loan authority to invest in solar and potentially dual use projects. I'll hand it back over to Max to talk about energy costs and needs, policy, and permitting.
Thanks, Emily. So I wanted to start here by sort of highlighting that, Emily's walked through some policies and funding opportunities that are out there that are helping to support renewable energy development, including dual use solar. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how it's not just policy driving new renewable development, and it's not just the availability of those public dollars, it's also just cost on a pure technology basis. So this here is a figure from a report released last month by Lazard, a financial services company that has been an international leader in assessing energy costs for many years. Lazard releases an annual report on the levelized cost of energy. This means, this phrase, taking into account all the various costs associated with producing energy, the upfront capital investment of actually, putting steel in the ground, in the case of solar, racking systems and panels, operations and maintenance, keeping a project going, and then for non-renewable projects, fuel costs, among other things. The levelized cost of energy says, what does it cost, considering all of these, to produce a megawatt hour of power, which is enough, incidentally, to power roughly a month of energy for an average household. Initially, Lazard looked at sort of traditional sources of energy, started folding in renewables a few years ago. They released a separate report, coincidentally, with the levelized cost of energy called the Levelized Cost of Energy Storage. This year, they just rolled everything together and have a comprehensive levelized cost of energy plus. And I put the URL for that report on this slide. It's fascinating stuff. If you're at all interested in this, I'd encourage you to, go check it out. In any event, turning to the figure, what should be relatively easy to see if you look at the left side of the figure is that along with wind, solar is the cheapest power source out there per unit of power. About $24 per megawatt hour on the low end of that range. What maybe is slightly less obvious from the figure is that word in the heading, unsubsidized. This is an analysis on an unsubsidized basis, doesn't account for those federal dollars, doesn't account for federal tax policy that helps to incentivize renewable energy. The report includes a separate chart that does compare resources, including those subsidies. And on that chart, again, if you pull up the report yourself, you can see that the subsidized cost of solar at the bottom end of the range is $0. That's kind of a wild figure, but what that tells you, you can imagine that even totally setting aside those policy drivers, renewable energy mandates, there's going to be some interest in solar procurement nationally and certainly in the Northwest. Next slide, please. And that is in fact what we are finding, is significant interest by utilities in going out and bringing on new solar. So about a month ago, the Washington-based investor-owned utility Puget Sound Energy released its 2023 Electric Progress Report. It's a report founded on a complex analysis that shows the company's projections of what resources it will need in order to reliably and affordably provide electricity to its customers. So that what's going to have to go out and build or buy in order to, again, meet those needs, and also its policy obligations at the lowest reasonable cost. And that phrase, lowest reasonable cost, is Washington's formulation of the phrase least cost, least risk, which you might hear elsewhere. I'm probably going to say it again later. In any event, these are kind of magic words that regulators use to help decide ultimately what costs these private electric utilities can include in their customers' bills and recover. So, in any event, as you can see here, Puget Sound Energy has identified over 1,000 megawatts of solar by 2030. So that's in 6.5 years. and over 2,500 megawatts by 2045 as part of their preferred portfolio of lowest reasonable cost resources. Important element of this chart that you can also see in the legend there is that all of the solar selected by the utility, it would be located in Washington. And just for a little bit of context, 1,000 megawatts is almost twice the amount of solar that was installed in Washington as of the end of 2022, which was the most recent figure I could find. And again, would need to be developed in just 6.5 years. So a quick caveat, this report does not mean that Puget will definitely go out and buy or build 1,000 megawatts of solar by 2030. Ultimately, what they'll actually do is issue a series of competitive solicitations to seek bids from the market, from developers, and plug all those bids into a complicated model, use that to select which resources it will actually buy. What it does mean is that the company has included a number of reasonable market costs related to different resources, identified what technically and technologically it needs on its system, and based on that analysis, solar is looking really good. Next slide, please. Now, if you think those Puget Sound energy numbers are big, check out PacifiCorp. If you can. This is a busy slide. PAC, PacifiCorp PAC as we call it in shorthand, is a large complex utility with service territory in a number of states, including in the Northwest, Oregon and Washington, where it operates as Pacific Power, and Idaho, where it operates as Rocky Mountain Power. So the size and complexity of the utility is a reason for the complexity of this map. What the map shows, though, is all of the energy generating resources that the company has identified in its integrated resource plan as least cost, least risk. And this integrated resource plan, incidentally, is a 2023 document that, again, was released, I want to say maybe a month and a half ago. Just, again, brief context note, integrated resource plan, similar to the electric progress report that I talked about a minute ago from Puget, but a little bit more direct regulatory significance. The electric progress report is mostly an informational document for Puget Sound Energy's regulator, the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. The integrated resource plan is subject to acknowledgement, which means that ultimately it can be used as evidence in a downstream rate case that might affect the utility's ability to actually recover costs from customers. So because the exercise is similar, though, means that PAC won't necessarily bring on exactly the solar resources showed in this figure, but just that based on the company's, again, very sophisticated analysis right now, solar is looking really good. Now, because of the size and complexity of this figure, on the next slide, I've broken out what that looks like for the Northwest in a little bit more clarity. So next slide, please. So these are the figures from PacifiCorp's analysis as to what solar resources are showing up as least cost, least risk in their 2023 IRP preferred portfolio. Let you take a look at those specific figures yourself, but if you add up the Oregon and Washington solar in the company's preferred portfolio, you get over 2,500 megawatts by 2030, 6.5 years. That is, again, a tremendous amount of solar. Then we've got another 200 megawatts of Idaho solar. Throw it all together, it's more than Puget's 2045 figure. And again, 6.5 years, pretty wild. Next slide, please. Finally, I wanted to include Idaho Power for a couple of reasons. First, the numbers I shared from Puget and PAC, pretty eye-popping. They're 2023 analyses from utilities with state mandates to transition to 100% clean power. 2023 analyses means that they're going to account for the latest tax credits that were established by the Federal Inflation Reduction Act. So that depresses the cost of those resources, and state mandates to transition to 100% clean power. I mean, the kind of direct line from that to selection of renewables is fairly clear. Idaho Power, on the other hand, this is a 2021 analysis, so that's before the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits were there to be modeled, and they are not currently subject to 100% clean electricity mandate. Idaho doesn't have one, and even though they have service territory in Oregon, they were carved out from that 100% clean law. Their service territory in the state is quite small. To be fair to the company, they do have an internal goal of achieving 100% clean energy by 2045. But again, it's a goal. It's not a policy mandate. So bearing in mind that, you would expect these figures to be probably less bullish than the Puget and PAC figures we looked at before, you can still see there in that right-hand column, 1,405 megawatts of solar in Idaho Power's preferred portfolio. That's, again, it's from an integrated resource plan, kind of talked a little bit about what that actually means. In this case, it means that the company's analysis suggests that is a least cost, least risk resource that they would like to go to market and buy. So Idaho Power is currently working on a 2023 integrated resource plan. We'll see what that looks like. I think it's fair, based on everything that we've talked about here, to assume that there will probably be even more solar there. So next slide. All of that goes to show that there is a huge potential market for new solar in the Northwest. Doesn't say much about dual use directly. So that's what this next section is going to talk about a little bit more. What are some of the kind of subtler policies in place in the Northwest that may help to make sure at least some of that solar is dual use, or if not make sure, at least point utilities in the direction of, and developers in the direction of dual use. So an important note about these Northwest clean energy mandates is that they don't just say thou shalt be 100% clean. They also include policy statements designed to promote clean energy projects that have certain co-benefits. So, for example, the excerpt here is from Washington's Clean Energy Transformation Act. That's the law that established 100% requirement for Washington utilities. And this law defines the public interest, which is another set of magic words that are important to regulators, as including the equitable distribution of energy benefits, as well as public health, economic, and environmental benefits. None of those directly references dual use, but when you apply lenses like these, dual use starts to look pretty good. Next slide, please. Similarly, Oregon's HB 2021, our state's 100% clean electricity law, establishes a policy that clean energy projects should create additional direct benefits, including from the perspectives of employment, equity, and resiliency. Again, not a direct nod to dual use, but through these lenses, dual use looks pretty good. Next slide, please. So, state governments are also putting some money where their mouths are on these issues. And in the case of Washington, this does include some explicit references to dual use. So, this slide is an excerpt from the budget that the Washington legislature passed this year, where they decided in coordination with the governor's office to dedicate almost $40 million in grants for certain clean energy projects with a preference for, among other things, dual use solar with an active agriculture component. Next slide, please. And the budget also includes another $10 million specifically and only for dual use solar projects. So throw it all together, you've got about $50 million, which Some of that is directly related to dual use. Some of it has a preference for dual use. This is not insignificant by any stretch. It's a significant chunk of change. Next slide, please. Oregon is also putting up money that could help with dual use solar development. Figured the last few slides were a little word heavy, so here I'll just kind of point you in the right direction and talk through things a little bit more. So first, we've got the Community Renewable Energy Project Grant Program. This was established as a part of HB 2021, which again is Oregon's 100% clean electricity law. The law defines community renewable energy projects as, quote, renewable energy systems, storage systems, microgrids, or energy-related infrastructure that promote energy resilience, increase renewable energy generation or renewable energy storage capacity, and provide a direct benefit to a particular community in the form of increased community energy resilience, local jobs, economic development, or direct energy cost savings to families and small businesses. The program does not directly reference dual use projects, but it does have a number of provisions. If you kind of dig into the more detailed language of the program, that are designed to prioritize rural communities. And again, the program's frame of supporting projects with co-benefits to the communities in which the projects are located seems to mesh well with dual use. And as in Washington, the Oregon legislature allocated $50 million for the program. Next up, Community Solar Program. This program dates all the way back to 2016 when it was established as part of Oregon's Coal to Clean bill, a big complex piece of legislation that received national attention at the time. In any event, the basic idea of the Community Solar Program, you may already be familiar with these, is that utility customers can pay to subscribe to a particular solar project and in return receive a credit on their bills reflecting the energy generated by that solar project. In itself, once again, the program does not contemplate dual use, but the model of creating a more intimate connection between project subscribers and a specific project means that projects with co-benefits are likely to be more attractive to potential subscribers. To that end, the project in the photo here is an AgriSolar installation called Solar Harvest, located in Wilsonville, Oregon, that came online fairly recently and is preparing to launch as a community solar project. The developer was Oregon Clean Power Co-op, and the agricultural elements of the project are carried out by Oregon State University's Ag Extension program. Emily is going to talk a little bit more about that later. But in any event, the OSU folks are researching the agricultural side of the potential co-benefits of this project, things like increased water retention, reduced heat stress. Again, I'll defer to Emily on the specifics there. But as another side note on this project, Emily and I, plus some of our colleagues, visited the project 2 weeks ago. And speaking only for myself and not for the organization, I was excited enough that that afternoon I went home and submitted a subscriber interest form. Project's less than 15 miles from my house, and it's just a lovely spot. In any event, moving on to the last bullet, customer-supported renewables. This was another piece of HB 2021, which established a new community-supported renewables program that is also getting ready to launch. Doesn't actually exist yet, but it's actively in the works. The idea here is that local governments can partner with a regulated utility to serve the residents within the jurisdiction of the local government with power from specific identified clean energy projects. Again, not a direct reference to dual use, but again, we expect that this more intimate connection between people and projects will likely support the development of projects with co-benefits, including dual use or AgriSolar projects. And one more thing before moving to the next slide, bit of a caveat. We've talked about drivers of solar adoption in the Northwest. We've talked about elements of the policy environment that either will likely support or are already supporting development of dual use projects. All this doesn't mean that all or even a majority of projects in the region will be dual use. In fact, AgriSolar in particular may not make sense in a number of locations throughout the region that have an excellent solar resource lend themselves well to supporting economic projects that'll deliver low-cost power to utility customers while avoiding serious adverse impacts. That's all okay. Nobody is saying that dual use has to be a universal panacea, but it's definitely a good idea worth supporting where it makes sense, which leads us into the next slide. So having said that we should support it where it makes sense, it can also be hardest to actually develop dual use projects where it makes the most sense. Policies that are understandably designed to protect farmland from conservation can also inadvertently preclude effective dual use. So on this slide, I've included an excerpt from Oregon's tortuous and torturous, to me at least, having served on a rulemaking advisory committee for this language, rules implementing the state's really arcane land use policy. And I'm an attorney, I've practiced land use law in other states before, and Oregon definitely has one of the most complex systems, if not the most complex, that I have encountered. In any event, take a spin through that language, and once you've parsed it all out, what you come away with is solar can only be permitted if it is not located on prime soils. To put it another way, there is a strong prohibition in rule against solar projects being located on prime agricultural soils. So to step onto a soapbox for a minute, if we do really want dual use to take off in the region, we also need to address this kind of barrier. It's very challenging for farmland conservation advocates who are fending off all kinds of non-agricultural uses, especially things like subdivisions, resorts. I understand this. I've worked before as a farmland conservation advocate, but solar really isn't like a subdivision. For one thing, most permitting authorities will require a solar developer to adhere to a decommissioning plan that requires the land to be restored to its initial condition at the end of a project's useful life, and to back that plan up with some form of financial assurance. But perhaps most importantly, and more relevant to this conversation, solar is not inherently a conversion of land. It is certainly possible not only to maintain an agricultural use on a solar project, but even to co-optimize the project for both agricultural production and energy generation. Which brings me to the point at which I step off my soapbox and hand things back to Emily to go into more depth on how solar and agriculture can work together harmoniously.
Great, thanks, Max. So Max mentioned many of these topics, but just to recap and provide a little additional context, the most limiting factor to getting any new energy projects online in our region is transmission. Put simply, we can't build many more projects or reach our goals if we do not build more transmission. Our land use policies are out of date, as Max mentioned, and severely limit solar development and also dual use solar. Some of what Renewable Northwest is currently working on includes supporting bills this session that make changes to our land use goals to speed up the process of getting renewable energy projects permitted. We currently don't have many dual use projects in our region. We have one pollinator project in Medford, Oregon by Pine Gate Renewables, but we have been hearing that there are more on the way. Hopefully this will encourage others in our region to look into the prospect of dual use. And Max mentioned the agrivoltaic research site Solar Harvest in Wilsonville, Oregon. And this is a really great site that is well positioned for visitors to come and learn about dual use. OSU has a lot of great research on dual use that I think will be particularly helpful in helping propel our region into seriously considering wider implementation. Speaking of research, as we write the dual use report update, we've come across some new interesting findings on dual use, and some of the topics pertain to the potential of dual use with power generation, crop compatibility, and productivity, with also water conservation, lamb growth and livestock grazing habits when co-located with solar, and ecosystem benefits. So I'll talk a little bit about those now. As we learn more about dual use, we find that it has the potential to mitigate many of our challenges. This isn't necessarily new information, but as I mentioned previously, A lot of farmland is already feeling the effects of drought. With climate change, the timing of our water supply will be altered and crops will be even more adversely impacted. However, according to the last National Climate Assessment, actual water demands will vary depending on adaptive management decisions and crop requirements. I think this is a hopeful statement that illustrates that water requirements for crops are dependent on management decisions. Implementing solar above crops can be one of those adaptive management decisions available to farmers. Of course, not all cropland can be co-located with solar and we'll need more water conservation measures. But to meet our energy needs, at least, we don't need all cropland to be converted to an AgriSolar system. In fact, a few of the newer research articles are now stating that we need less than 1% of cropland to implement AgriSolar technology to significantly offset global energy demand. And then decentralization of food and electricity supply is another benefit. AgriSolar enables dual use of the same unit of land for both power generation and agriculture, considerably increasing land use efficiency. In some cases, we find increased yields of crops, especially with leafy plants, as they've been shown to produce greater yields in shade than in sunlight. Crops exposed to increased sunlight require more water, and with solar panels providing shade and cooler temperatures, less water is lost to evaporation, and the plants require less water from irrigation. And cropland has been found to provide the best microclimate for solar. Solar panels are most productive with lots of sunlight, light winds, moderate temperatures, and low humidity. And these are all the same conditions that are best for many agricultural crops. An OSU study found that in an analysis of 17 land cover types, croplands were found to be ranked among the top classes suitable for solar power potential. We've also found a symbiotic relationship between solar and crops. The shade provided by solar benefits crop production by increasing yields and reducing water requirements for many plants, but then also that cooler microclimate provided by the plants improve solar energy production by 10%. Crops generally considered suitable for growing in agrivoltaic systems include leafy greens, fodder varieties such as clover grass, several fruits and berries and herbs, and spices. But now researchers are looking at a variety of crops outside of the traditional shade-tolerant crops. And outside of food crops, researchers are also looking into whether more traditional row crops can be co-located with solar. For example, Purdue University is conducting field trials combining traditional row crops like corn and soy with raised solar panels. And panels can provide protection from extreme weather for fruits and berries, where it's been found that from an agricultural perspective, maybe the benefits of stable yields achieved through those crop protection measures outweigh potential shade-related yield reductions. For lamb growth and foraging behavior, we know that sheep grazing is it's a lower cost of maintenance. It takes place of traditional mowing. It can be good for soil, and there are benefits to livestock grazers as well. Solar grazing can offer livestock owners additional pasture opportunities and the opportunity to be paid for a valuable service, increasing income to their business and local economy. Some newer findings that we're discovering are that lamb live weight, or the weight they are before they go to production, does not differ between AgriSolar and traditional pastures. A 2021 study found that despite lower amounts of herbage offered on the solar pastures in their study compared to traditional pastures, the lamb live weight production did not differ when compared to lambs grazed on those traditional pastures, nor did foraging behavior differ. And then something I've recently learned is that we have a sheep shortage, which can make it difficult for projects to obtain enough livestock to effectively manage vegetation. Some of our members have noted that to us, that it's hard to obtain enough livestock. The sheep industry has been in decline in the US for some time. So with the benefits of co-locating sheep and solar, we see this as an opportunity for the sheep industry. We had to provide a slide on lamb happiness. Another finding, I think it was from that same study, found that lambs spend most of their time under the shade of panels. And this was also postulated as another reason for that comparable lamb growth in each of the systems, as the lambs were less heat stressed with the shade from the panels. And also the sheep showed either similar or lower water intake between the pastures. So that means happier lambs. Okay. For ecosystem services, shading by solar panels may create more favorable microclimates for the growth of native vegetation, which can better stabilize soil and provide greater carbon sequestration potential compared to conventional solar vegetation management practices. And if native grasses and forbs are planted, these typically have deeper root systems and facilitate accumulation of soil, improve soil stabilization, all those things I just mentioned, minimize erosion and reduce water runoff. And then pollinators can be great if there's a neighboring cropland that can benefit from more pollinators. A case study by a national laboratory found that the value of pollinator habitat on lands in the US designated as proposed or potential solar sites is valued between 1.5 and 3.2 billion. So not insignificant. Implementation. So our region supports a variety of crops, and many of them have already been deemed suitable for dual use. But we do have differences in climate, and so implementation will be very site specific according to that second or third use combined with solar. The region, of course, and then also the specific location. They're with the community, technology, and market. And AgriSolar is dynamic and evolving. There's new policy and new research that's furthering our understanding and illuminating new opportunities. So it's an exciting space to be in. So what we're working on now is, as we mentioned, an update to our 2019 dual use report. That's largely focusing on new policy and research, but as something else we're also excited about is a guide that we're including for anyone who's interested in getting started in a dual use project, with practical considerations for combining solar with livestock, pollinators, crops, or conservation. But it is a work in progress, so if anybody would like to help us out, we are open ears. And I believe that's all we have. Thank you. Here's our contact. Questions?
That's great. Yeah, we did have quite a few questions, and I've allowed everyone to unmute. Judy, I'm going to ask you specifically to ask your questions because you had some great ones in there. I'll start at the top of them. Blake asked if there's case studies showing solar projects skipping the interconnection queue and going straight to the utility.
Yeah, I saw that question in the chat, and I've been trying to think. I'm not aware of any. If anybody else is, I would be interested in hearing about it. But interconnection can be one of the barriers to actually getting these projects going, especially given transmission constraints in the Northwest. The possibility that folks who go through the interconnection process will be told by the utility that they're trying to connect to that they'd be responsible for costly and time-consuming upgrades. So definitely a challenge, but I'm not aware of any projects that have been able to essentially bypass that.
And a similar question, Joe asked if there's a case to be made that farmers should have off-grid solar in order to avoid transmission requirements. Does that make financial sense?
Yeah, I think that off-grid systems probably make sense for a number of farms. It's a little bit it's not an area where I feel like we have strong expertise, since, as you probably heard from from earlier, we do tend to focus on sort of the broader grid and more on utility scale projects than on those smaller off-grid systems. But I'm also pretty sure, I think mostly as a function of past work I've done, that there are like federal government programs designed to help with both technical assistance and funding for those types of projects. So yes, definitely good idea.
Yeah, like REAP is a good way to do that. Someone else asked about co-ops and their policy. We talked a lot more about the utilities, but could you speak to co-ops, especially in Washington, I think was their question.
Yeah. The co-ops in Washington are still subject to that 100% clean electricity law. They, generally speaking, the co-ops tend to have very clean systems right now. So when we talk to them in the abstract, they're not necessarily as bullish on bringing a lot of new clean generation onto their system from sort of a system perspective. That said, I can't speak to the openness of the co-ops to some of those like smaller community scale projects. Expect, just based on sort of the co-op ethos, that there would be openness to working with folks who are interested in developing those kinds of projects.
Sure, that's great. I see a question from Diana in there about resources for design strategies. There's some really good stuff out there, Diana. We have it in our library, but there's also companies like Spade and Celestica that have some apps and some computer programs that you can run that help you place your modules. Do you guys have any more you want to say on that question? Or she's asking if there's resources for design strategies, and there are quite a lot of them. And we can help through AgriSolar, but do you two have any other thoughts on that?
We debated on going this route in our dual use update with including design strategies and technology advice, but I don't know if we necessarily have all of the latest and greatest on technology information and design requirements. But yeah, there are definitely a lot of resources I've come across, but I think you probably are better positioned, Stacy, to point people in the right direction there.
Sure. So Diana, if you want to drop us an email at agrisolar@ncat.org, we're happy to follow up with you. Judy, would you want to come off mute? Your questions are great, and I don't want to miss anything. Would you be willing? Can you hear me, Judy?
Yep.
Okay, I'll let you go.
Yep. Yeah, so I thank you for the presentation, by the way, and I'm on the East Coast, so I'm doing my best to follow the West Coast simultaneously. So this was helpful. And one of the things that I was wondering about is there an effort from a policy and strategy perspective to reframe what I call elevated solar as a farm viability tool? Therefore, instead of having the law that Oregon has and many conservation, I in the field of land conservation, are propagating that if it's on high quality farmland or associated farmland, it's elevated, thus agrivoltaics, as opposed to a prohibition. And then the side question with that is the messaging that we're always saying solar looks great because it's cheap. It's cheaper, it costs less. So the bottom value statement that we keep hammering is it costs less. Therefore, kilowatt per acre is our value metrics. Are you working on, or do you know of others that are trying to reframe the value statement to farm viability, soil quality, the water health, and therefore spreading it out so it's not the same density of energy per acre is a positive thing in the cost analysis? So they're related but different questions.
Yeah, those are fantastic questions. I can say the farm viability angle was one that a number of folks brought up in the 2019 rulemaking that I referenced earlier in Oregon. Say the responses varied according to the community. In the Willamette Valley in Oregon, there is still sort of a strong view that solar is a threat as opposed to a viability tool. In the more, like in Eastern Oregon, Southern Oregon, there's more openness to the idea of solar as a farm viability tool, and the state agency, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, that sort of sets policy, I think is increasingly open-minded. So, you know, some folks that start with a lens of farmland conservation or farmland preservation, I think were initially skeptical and are starting to express stronger interest in seeing some proof of concept, which is why we see money in the state budgets in Oregon and Washington going to help support this type of project, and see whether, you know, on the one hand, we can meet a significant amount of our energy needs with sort of more distributed, smaller community scale projects employing this type of sort of co-optimization, and also on the other hand, whether it's possible to scale up some of these dual use concepts. So it's dynamic. Yes, there is definitely an effort to sort of frame things that way. It's very much a muddle at the moment, though. And in terms of sort of thinking about different metrics as opposed to just you know, the traditional way of sort of running a financial model on a solar installation and trying to sort of pack panels densely in order to maximize kilowatts and therefore dollars per acre. Yeah, I do think that there are a number of folks thinking much more broadly, and the people we talked to at Solar Harvest just a couple weeks ago were talking, for example, about really trying to again, co-optimize and think about how, you know, we're not just thinking about dollars per acre from solar production. We're thinking about, you know, if you spread the panels out, what does that allow you to do agriculturally? What can your yields be? How can you like make money that way? At the same time, you're making money. So it's sort of a different financial model. And I do think folks are actively thinking about how to do that. It's a little bit hard because there are, I think, few people out there who have the sort of joint expertise in how to design a solar project and how to design a farm. But the more folks talk to each other and cross-pollinate and work on that, I think it feels like we're making progress.
Great. I was wondering on the policy that you went over that listed dual use, are they including pollinator habitat in their definition of dual use, or is it crop co-location or grazing, or how do they define dual use?
Yeah, so that the language is from the state budget, which I don't think has a detailed definition. So I expect that there will probably be some work by the implementing agency to you know, put some sideboards on that. I do think for the like $40 million Washington program that references dual use, it does specifically say dual use with an active agriculture component. The way, again, from having kind of worked in the traditional farmland conservation space also, I would guess that pollinator habitat is not going to qualify there, just based on sort of plain language. But for the other program, I don't recall language around active agriculture, so maybe that would be a little bit broader. Hard to say.
And maybe, you know, beekeeping was incorporated, something like that. That might qualify. It looks like Joe is asking some questions about vertical bifacial panels and large farm equipment and irrigation. Do you guys have any? I know there's some in California. We did a nice case study on Sanzan down there. It's outside of Davis on our map, if anybody wants to look at it. Do you see any vertical bifacial going on in your area? And if so, is it integrated with farming equipment or irrigation?
The one example I know of is at the solar harvest site that we've been discussing. We don't have really many other dual use sites except for that pollinator project, and then maybe some smaller projects. But at Solar Harvest, where they're doing research, they do have those vertical bifacial panels, and they're actually planning on hosting an event where they'll put the panels vertical, and then they'll have farmers come and bring their tractors to do pass-throughs to see how it goes. And I can't remember how widely they're spaced, but they're designed for the tractor to make 2 passes through the rows. So
you should get pictures. I would love to see that.
yeah. Hopefully that gets planned soon and we can spread the word, because I would love to attend that as well.
That's great. And Judy's interested in rocks hitting the panels. Yes, yeah. So it would probably be a good video, really, more than anything to show. Well, I think we're about at the top of the hour, you guys. Thank you so much. If you all think of a question later, just email us and we'll get questions onto them, and their contact information is right here. It's Emily at Renewable Northwest and Max at Renewable Northwest. Thank you guys. This was great. We'll have this recording up in a couple weeks. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for telling us about the 27 feet. That's great. We're looking forward to seeing it someday.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.